The IDAWRA is dedicated to the advancement of water resources management, research, and education. Members represent a community of water professionals with diverse backgrounds, but they share engagement in solving some of the toughest water resources challenges. Thank you to our sponsors and members, Avista Corporation, Brown and Caldwell, Haley and Aldridge, HDR Engineering, and Jacobs Engineering Group. Stay in touch at awraidaho.org.
Here you go. All right, welcome everyone to another edition of the Meet the Professional series with the Idaho section of the American Water Resources Association. I'm Kendra Kaiser, and today we have with us Toni Hardesty. She is the Western U.S. and Canada Division Director for the Nature Conservancy, a nonprofit global conservation organization. In her current role as the Western U.S. and Canada Division Director, she leads efforts with 11 Western states and Canada to maximize the collective contribution to the Conservancy's mission, focusing on collaborative conservation projects that protect land and water for nature and people. Prior to assuming her post with the Nature Conservancy, she served as the Director of Idaho's Department of Environmental Quality. She was appointed by Governor Dirk Kempthorne in 2004 and reappointed by Governor James Risch and C.L. Butch Otter. As director, she was responsible for leading efforts to preserve the quality of Idaho's air, land, and water for the use and enjoyment now and into the future. As an Idaho native, Hardesty has also worked for the Environmental Protection Agency and in the private sector as an environmental consultant, working with and assisting private industry, government agencies, and nonprofits of a wide range of environmental issues. She is an outdoor enthusiast, and her husband enjoy going backpacking, hiking, skiing, and exploring remote places. So thank you again so much for coming and joining us today.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah. So it's really cool seeing all of the different positions that you've had up to this point. I guess maybe we can start with what kind of got you interested in and started on thinking about these kinds of problems.
Yeah, well, so I graduated from college when it was the 80s. And that was sort of like just when the environmental movement as a profession was really taking off. And in fact, I think when I graduated from Boise State University with my degree in environmental health, I don't remember the exact number, but there were less than 10 of us who actually were graduating that year with that degree. It might have been more like about 5. So it was a very small number. And again, it was something that was just really taking off as a profession. In fact, I remember telling my dad, when I was getting my degree, he said, "Oh, that's great, but what are you going to actually do for a living?" You know, there just was not that many jobs out there at that point in time. But I had tried some different, I knew I was interested in something in the science, something in biology, but I really hadn't quite found what was that thing that was really going to be passionate for me. And in all honesty, I read Rachel Carson's A Silent Spring, and I was like, there it is. That's what I want to work on, is things like that make a difference. And so that was the thing that really, and then when I took my first environmental class in college, then I was like, yep, this is it. So
cool. Yeah, man, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring is super cool. I mean, I can't imagine right when it was coming out too, like what a huge impact that'd be making on people.
Right, absolutely. And the fact that it is still making a lasting impact on people, isn't that just amazing? That I even meet young people today who say that that was incredibly influential, a book that they read.
Yeah, and I mean, just having literary style, which is quite different than our current structure of like creating scientific publications. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what did it look like when you were leaving, Boise State into your first position? What was your first mechanism of getting into things?
Yeah, so I did an internship. That was a really important thing for me. I got an internship at the Idaho Department of Environmental Quality, which I years later came back, was actually the director for, but that's actually where I started my career. So I was fortunate enough to do an internship there, which really, again, cemented my area of interest. And then my first professional job, actually, outside of that, was working for EPA. So I moved to Seattle and then worked for EPA Region 10 as my first career move there, and really learned a lot. It was a great learning experience, but I also really learned that I didn't have maybe the patience for the larger scale organization. I just didn't see at that moment in time my ability to maybe have the same sort of impact. So great opportunity, learned a lot, also learned a lot about myself at that moment in time.
Yeah, there is something really interesting about particularly in early jobs right after graduation of being able to identify what it is that you actually like doing. So what kind of, were there some, aside from like identifying the things that you were particularly interested in, did you find that there were some really useful skills or tools that came out of that internship that helped you get that job at the EPA?
Yeah, absolutely. So one, I think there were a couple things that came out of that. Is one, really an appreciation for understanding the whole picture of what it takes in order to be, successful. So like writing skills, presenting skills. I mean, you come out of college, I think, at least, with a lot of many of the hard skills that you need that you've learned. But at least back then, there wasn't as much emphasis on the other skills that you were going to need to be successful. So that was really helpful for me in the fact that those were the first times in my internship when I actually had to sit down and write a paper that wasn't maybe necessarily a technical paper, like a memo to someone, when I actually had to present. And those were also things that I realized at that point in time were skills that I needed to build. And I needed to work on those on my own, and I needed to do some extra work, but I really learned that those were going to be an important part of career building. The other one I learned is networking and how important it was to understand what was happening in the field and to make professional connections. So joining associations and affiliations with groups so that you really could understand the spectrum of opportunities out there and actually meet people, hear about their jobs, figure out what might be interesting to you, learn about different employers, the pros and the cons. So those were other things that really were important learning moments for me during that internship.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, it's interesting to think about those in combination too, networking plus actually getting a perspective for what's going on in the big picture just in the field in general too.
Yeah.
So so you went to the EPA, and then what was the next step after that one?
Then I went into private consulting. So I was in Seattle at that point in time, and then I went to work for an environmental consulting firm. And I actually spent about 14 years doing environmental consulting, which was also very rewarding. I learned a lot, great variety, great opportunity to work on a whole host of different projects. It was also the time though where there was incredible mergers and acquisitions happening. So I also learned a lot about that I didn't really fully intend to learn, but during my career span in 14 years, working for 3 different companies and actually never really changing companies, just the companies changing themselves. And so those were also moments where you learn about the business side. And at that point in time, I was moving into the management roles. And so both continuing to lead projects, but also moving more into the management structure and maybe less of the technical side that I had been working in prior.
Yeah, which is interesting, I think, looking at a lot of different scientist paths of starting, maybe at the bench or in the field, and then you go into the analysis and then project lead, and then it kind of is this common trend of going into management and admin. Do you think, do you miss some of that stuff nowadays?
I do miss some of that stuff. Yeah, there's no doubt about it that that my heart hungers sometimes for, technical projects that I can dive into deeply. There's just a flow and a reward that comes from being able to do that. So there's no doubt about that I get to do very little of at this point in time, although I do know that part about myself. So I always try to carve out some time in my schedule to work on a project that I can call a little bit of my own, or work with a project team, not as a manager, but actually as a team member, because it means a lot to me. And I think it also keeps you grounded, right? In a way that you wouldn't be if you were only working superficially on things as a manager.
Yeah, for sure. I could definitely relate to that, and probably a lot of students as well. It's like when your PI uh, hasn't touched like code or real data in years, and you're like, this is hard. Don't you remember? Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So now that you have, once you were directing, let me see. So you were the director of the Department of Environmental Quality, and now you have this like really large regional position with the Nature Conservancy. What are some of the things that have like gotten you really excited about having, stepping into that kind of role?
Yeah. So I think, there's some similarities between those two roles and the things that I think are really wonderful about them. And then in some cases, they're different roles. I think for me, again, this goes back to a little bit about knowing yourself. So for the role as the director for the Idaho Department of Environmental Quality, I found that role to be incredibly rewarding. I really, really enjoyed that job. And partly because for me, it was the right size organization and the right feel that you could still have an impact, right? So I felt like we were doing something at a scale that mattered. It was Idaho, so it was bigger than an individual project scale. It was substantial that way, but it was still of the size that you actually could make a difference, meaning you could actually see your work come to fruition, and you could actually wake up and say, yeah, we did that, and that actually improved the environment, and that could happen in your career lifetime versus something that maybe was more esoteric and you weren't going to see it for years to come. And so that was my experience at DEQ. Really meaningful, really great people, working with people who are very mission oriented, which is always really nice as well, and feeling like you could actually, make a difference at the end of the day. More challenges with that job, it's just like anything else. It comes with the politics. And so that was one of the things that you have to learn to navigate, is the fact that, the environmental field oftentimes can be politicized, whether you agree with that or not, and you think it should be or should not. It's just a reality. And so you have to learn to work with people who come at it from a different place than you do, or they're just in a different place than you are with regards to that. It's also a huge growth opportunity to learn how to meet people where they're at and be able to have a conversation about those kinds of things. So when I came to the Nature Conservancy, it's the thing again that I like is feeling like can make a difference, it's of the size that we make an impact. It's very collaborative in nature, and I really like that. So I work with people. We work mostly with people who really also are agreeing to work with us. It's like, yes. And again, may have very different, come from different places, different backgrounds, different perspectives, but everybody's saying we're voluntarily going in to make this change. And so that really is super helpful. Our projects tend to take longer time periods. The conservation side takes longer. And so that can be challenging sometimes. I mean, we're just celebrating a huge project that we just completed in Canada, but it's been 10 years in the making, right? And so you have to have the perseverance to recognize that, these big projects, they are going to be worth it, but they do not happen overnight. They take a long time oftentimes to get that enduring and lasting change that you're looking for.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point that I wouldn't have thought about, the time frame of a project itself. I mean, again, coming from the academic side of things, you see master's projects 2 years, PhD projects maybe up to 5 or 6 or whatnot. But thinking of managing a project through the end to 10 years is a completely different scale, particularly also when you've spent time in the consulting world where projects can turn around really quickly, or
Exactly.
for the state where there is also like probably a shorter time frame.
Right.
Yeah, and being able to know yourself of whether or not you're going to be okay with that.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to think about, particularly in regards to like the political side of, environmental work. It seems like meeting people where they are is something, it's like a learned thing that you pick up over time. But have you found any resources, or were there mentors, or were there individuals or ideas that really like helped you grow in that way?
Yeah, it's a great question. I do actually think, even as you're saying it, I'm thinking, there probably should be more resources than than there are on that topic. There were definitely some good, I think, training classes that I was exposed to. And then I've done a lot of reading on that. And I think there's been more that has come out maybe more recently around climate change, right? And how do you engage with people who may not believe in climate change, or they see it from a very different perspective? And I think there's some really great information out there now. I would say there's maybe a little less when I was starting on that path. But I would say some of the most valuable information I got was, and I still use this to this day in so many places, it's very simple, but it's really powerful. Start with a place of inquiry. So ask people questions and then try to unpack that with more questions versus coming in with like, this is what I believe. Start with asking them what they believe and how they've come to believe that and what their experience has been that's shown that. And every time you start with a place of inquiry, I feel like it furthers the conversation in a way that you couldn't if you started with, this is my position. So understanding that other person leads to much more meaningful engagement. And then when you do engage with them about why you're coming from, I think your engagement's better because you understand where that conflict might exist or how you see things differently so that you can, address those.
That is such great advice. I am going to use that. And particularly when you're coming from, the STEM fields, that's kind of the goal of it in the first place, is you're coming to it with questions and curiosity. So applying that idea to other individuals makes a lot of sense as well.
Yeah. And my go-to line after I ask a question, and not because, I wouldn't say this every time, but many times I find myself then saying to somebody, tell me more about that. And then it gives you that, they sort of peel back the onion a little bit more, and they tell you a little bit more about why they've reached that conclusion or why they're coming from that direction.
Yeah, for sure. I've definitely found that with some of the folks that I've been working with in Idaho, of when you ask those kind of questions, it can just lead into insights that you would have never thought of because your background is really different. So that's super cool. Let's see, what else? So now, what does your typical day look like?
My typical day. So I would say, of course, it's a little different now that COVID-19 is happening, because typically I'm actually out in the field traveling, looking at the work that we're doing, engaging with people, actually in the landscapes and in places. So now most of that is, well, almost all of it is remote and virtual. But beyond that, I would say, in my position right now, I spend my goal, it doesn't always work this way, but my goal is kind of like a third, I say. So a third of my time is focused on management kinds of things, just, managing people, because that's part of my job and the operation and stuff. I still try to maintain a third of it, what I say, on conservation. And that's where we were talking before about like finding some projects that I can actually lean in on a technical basis, to sort of help with or get unstuck or to brainstorm with teams about. And then another third of it is sort of like operational business kinds of things that you just have to deal with, whether it's budgets that you're managing, doing budget reviews for people, dealing with policies and procedures that we have to, line with contracts that have to be signed and reviewed, those kinds of things. So that's how I like to divide up my time. And it sometimes works better than other days. So
yeah, for sure. Always. And it's interesting thinking about, both similar to navigating people with different backgrounds, the management side of things, as well as the operations side. That's also something that we don't get in a regular, STEM degree. Is that, again, something that you kind of picked up over time, found ways to like learn on your own, or how were you able to, progress in that way?
Yeah, it's a really good point. I would say I was really fortunate. The environmental consulting company that I went to work for after I left EPA had a very, very strong professional development program. And so I went in as a project manager. And so they had a very rigorous project management class. But if you really stepped back and looked at that project management, it transfers to management of all kinds, right? Like, you know, the way you run a project and some of the same skills that you need as far as learning how to manage a budget, learning how to manage your team, how to organize people to get collective things done. That all translates quite nicely as you move up into more of management roles. So that was super fortunate for me. I also am a huge podcast fan. And so when I run and walk, I listen to podcasts, and I'm just a geek for those kinds of podcasts that really speak to management and things like that. So like Brene Brown talks, Dare to Lead. Like I just finished hers. The Heath brothers, like Switch, or how to work upstream on system problems. I love those kinds of things. And so podcasts for me really, really get me thinking. So between reading, podcasts, and then I just am a big believer in you just never stop growing in that arena, right? Like you never are completely competent as a manager. And I think the minute you think you are, like you've lost it, because things evolve and change, and the workforce evolves and changes, and the skills you need evolve and change. And so I'm just a huge believer in that you just have to continue to learn and grow and take training classes. So every year when I'm doing my objectives, I'm identifying these are the kinds of, classes that I'm going to be taking and books I'm going to be reading, so that I know that I'm moving along that curve.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really great. I mean, particularly considering like how things change so rapidly. I mean, we joke about it. It's like, okay, yeah, 20, 30 years ago, we were still using like dial-up at home. Right. And now we all have personal computers in our pockets. That makes a big difference on how you manage teams and things like that.
It does. And it used to be, when I first started my career, it was totally acceptable and expected that the manager was going to come in, make the decision, tell you how it was done. And there wasn't necessarily an expectation that you were going to have a whole lot as a staff person input into that, right? Like that doesn't work anymore. That is not what's expected, and it's really not effective. We call it shared leadership here at the Nature Conservancy, and we really embrace it, meaning you build diverse teams and you really share that leadership, and the best product comes out when you actually have a diverse team that is all providing meaningful and equal input into the outcome. And it's so powerful and it works so well, but it's completely different than the management skills that I learned 20 years ago, or the role models, I should say, maybe that I had back then, right?
Yeah. That sounds really cool. I like that idea. I'll have to look into that some more as well. Yeah. So now, I guess, are you still hiring people in your position, or is that somebody else's kind of wheelhouse?
No, I do. So I have, for me, I have 12 business units that report to me. So that is 11 Western states and Canada. And each of those business units, it has a director, and those directors report to me. So I hire those. In fact, I am in the process right now. I'm hiring a new director for Nevada, and I'm just kicking off a recruitment for the director in Arizona. So
cool. Yeah. So I recall as a student, I didn't really remember, or I didn't really realize what these other kind of upper admin positions looked like, or what kind of skills you would need for them. So when you're going out and looking for these new director positions, what kind of characteristics or applicants are you looking for?
Yeah. So I think I would say there's maybe some that are universal across the board. And then one of the things we do is we look at each of the different programs, and we try to be reflective of either where the program is at right now and what it wants to become, and what kind of leader might get them to that place, or challenges that they might have that we need a particular skill or expertise. But I would say in general, we are a very shared leadership model person. So we are looking for somebody who is a leader, but also comes in and knows how to share that leadership, the ability to build a high functioning team and actually be a catalyst for what we say, letting people bring their best selves to work. So we really want somebody who knows how to motivate a team and get a team to work functioning as a whole. It's got to be somebody who has good, what I guess I would call good soft skills, interpersonal skills, high emotional intelligence, ability to deal with, like what we were talking about before, a diverse, broad set of stakeholders and people that we work with. So they have to be able to be comfortable functioning across that spectrum, all the way from people who are very technical and very steeped in the environment to people who are not, who are going to be more conversational about it, to dealing with people who might be a little bit more opposed to it and being able to have a conversation with them about something like climate change or something that might be a tougher situation for them to handle. In the background, they don't have to be experts at like budgets and some of those kinds of things, but they have to have a working understanding of it. At the end of the day, they're going to have to manage a budget for that organization. They're going to have to manage the staff, and they're going to have a baseline technical information understanding that is going to allow them to engage in the appropriate level. Again, they don't have to be the technical experts at this area, but they've got to be comfortable dealing with technical information that's going to be coming their direction.
So do a lot of them come from other organizations or places where they've had, some similar type of leadership role that allows them to have that kind of working understanding? Or is it also possible that somebody, like, could a scientist from a university become a director, or do they have to like direct something else first? Or, is there a certain position in a state or government agency that would make it easy to like slot in?
So it is possible for that. And what I would say is that almost generally, when you look at applicants that come in, no one is going to be able to check every single one of those boxes, usually for the most part, right? They're going to come in with either great management experience, but maybe not nonprofit experience, or they've got really great conservation experience and nonprofit experience, but they haven't necessarily been a manager. So there's hardly ever that you're going to get a candidate that can check every single box. And so we really do recruit, and the diversity of candidates that we get are quite across the board: university, nonprofit, government, consulting. And I would say across the board, we have hired all of those different people for these different roles. And some of that depends on the team that we are hiring them into as well, right? Like if they've got a very, very strong conservation team underneath of them, it's not as important that they have a really steeped conservation experience. And so it's partly looking at the team and is that the right fit that complements that team, or the need that they might have at that moment in time.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it's super cool to just think about how all those different types of backgrounds can facilitate the overall mission of the Nature Conservancy as well.
And I also think that's one of the things that makes it so powerful, is bringing people in with those different backgrounds, because you really have people approaching the problems and the challenges and thinking about it in very different ways. And we're at our most powerful when all those people bring that perspective together. And it oftentimes ends up looking like something that no one person themselves would have crafted, because they wouldn't have had that perspective or that thought process to bring to it.
Yeah, for sure.
And those are some of our most fun and engaging meetings, I would say, as well.
Yeah, I can imagine, for sure. So that has all been super interesting. I guess maybe more on, the other side of the coin. What does balancing, doing the work-life balance look like for you? You've got a pretty big position with a lot of balls in the air. Like, how do you manage that?
Yeah. So I work really hard to try to balance that, and for a number of reasons. One, this really is a marathon job. It's not a sprint. And I really do believe that, like, the long haul is really, the long game is really where you're at. And I think if you burn yourself out or you don't feel good about how you're managing your personal life, I've met very few people who can truly be successful in their professional life if they feel like they are completely failing. I mean, successful in their professional life if they feel like they're completely failing their families or their work-life balance. For me, my best role models have been people who really can find that balance. And I say that recognizing that there are times that I'm not as balanced as I wish I would, but it's really something that I strive for and I think is important. I also think it's really important to role model that to your employees. And I think if you are not living that, it really comes across as just cheap talk if you're telling everybody else that they should be, implementing work-life balance. And I do think that we get our best performance when we have that balance. I know for me, I will say some of my most creative ideas and some of the best ideas I have come up with are times when I was out hiking or camping or sitting in a chair looking at a lake, and I just had time to think. And not that I was even trying to think about work, but it just gave me the space and the time for ideas to come forward that I didn't have when I was sitting in front of my desk cranking out work. So I think our creativity and the better parts of ourselves come out when we can do that as well. And it's part of it's really just being disciplined. Part of it's being willing to, if not at least say no, ask for what you need as far as an extension or that time frame is not reasonable. Is there a way that we can do that later? And then trying to prioritize and those things that are important but not urgent, creating the space for that and not just being overrun by the urgency.
Yeah, man, there's so many good nuggets in there. I really appreciate the point about having time and space to think creatively. I was just talking with a PhD student about this, of like, that's one of the great things about a PhD is that you're afforded the time to really dive deep into something. And, you have products and goals, but, one of the really valuable things about a PhD is that you can take time to think. And so remembering to create that time for yourself throughout your career so that you can continue to be creative is definitely a good thing to keep in mind for sure.
Yeah.
Okay. I guess I'll have one more. What are you most looking forward to once COVID-19 is not having such a large impact on our lives?
Oh, yeah, that one's pretty easy for me. It's actually getting back out in the field in some way, shape, or form with my teams. I mean, you can read all you want about an environmental issue or about a conservation project, and there is nothing that substitutes for actually seeing it and hearing from the people who it's actually impacting. I mean, you just can't substitute that. And so for me, that's just a huge, it's always an inspiration. Like when I get to go to Alaska and, see the salmon in the streams, I mean, there, or even in North Idaho, there's just no way you can replace that. And so for me, I look forward to being able to do that because it reminds me of why we do what we do. So.
Yeah, for sure. And having that in-person connection to talk about what it looks, how things are going. It's, I think maybe a lot of us have gotten better at doing it over the internet, but at the end of the day, there's so much that you can't capture that you can in person.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that feeling is, I mean, like you said, Zoom is certainly better than conference calls. We keep making progress on that, but standing there with real life people who are telling you their story person to person is hard to replace.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me and ask all or answer all these kinds of questions. I think folks are going to be really excited to hear about your career path and all the insights that you've gained along the way. I'm sure.
Well, I hope there's something in there that's valuable to people. But
and hopefully, once things are back to normal, we could actually meet in person since you're here in Boise.
That would be great. I would enjoy that. Thanks so much for the opportunity and the conversation. It's really been a delight.
Yeah, thanks, Toni. It's super cool. I think and Kathy will probably like cut it for us, but it's really, you know, for me personally, it's super cool to hear your story, because there's so many times where people make it seem like career paths are linear, where it's
Right.
it's like, this is, you know, you have to pick where you're going to end up and then you need to plan to get there, versus like, wow, there's so many different places that you can go to give you different, you know, perspectives that can allow you to have a fruitful career, even if you don't know, like, this is definitely where I'm going to end up.
It's so true. I mean, I was asked that, like, after I got the job for the director for the Idaho Department of Environmental Quality, people were like, is this a job you've always thought about? I said, I never thought about that job more. I never did. I mean, I was open to opportunity. That's what I tell people, be open to opportunity. But no, I didn't sit down and say that's the job I wanted. And that's part of the beauty, I actually think, is being open to those things, and allowing things to speak to you and sort of saying, wow, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that, but I'm gonna be open to this opportunity and sort of explore it. So
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
Awesome.
All right.
Well, thanks
take
again.
care. Have a great weekend.
Yeah, you too.
Okay.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.